Welcome back to the Free Mind Podcast, where we explore topics in Western history, politics, philosophy, literature, and current events, with a laser focus on seeking the truth and an adventurous disregard for ideological and academic fashions. I'm Matt Burgess, an assistant professor of environmental studies and faculty fellow of the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. My guest today is Martín Carcasson. Martín Carcasson is a professor of communication studies at Colorado State University, where he is also the director of the CSU Center for Public Deliberation. His research focuses on helping communities work through wicked problems through better communication, community problem solving, and collaborative decision making. He is well known for designing and facilitating public dialogues throughout Colorado on some of our most difficult issues. In our conversation, Martín helps me talk through a question I have been struggling with, and that is, do moderates need to be more intolerant? Martín Carcasson, welcome to the Free Mind Podcast.
Thanks for having me.
This episode's going to be a little bit different from most of the ones I do. I've been looking to do an episode with somebody who can help me talk through an idea that I've been wrestling with regarding how to reduce political polarization. And the idea is, do moderates need to be more intolerant? And I wanted to do this with you for three reasons. One, you're someone I respect. Two, you're an expert in deliberative dialogue. And three, you mentioned in a conversation we had recently your own wrestling with something that I think is maybe related to the question I'm wrestling with. And that's the distinction between what you called moral clarity and what you called intellectual humility. So maybe to start, can you tell me what you mean by that?
Yeah, and I'll back up a second to kind of set some context, because a lot of the work that I do is to like look at the world through this lens of wicked problems. The short version of that is when I'm trying to help with an issue and looking at a problem, I try to really figure out what are all the aligning values, what are the different sides kind of care about, identify those values, put them on the table, and then really kind of dig in and look at the tensions between them. So a lot of my work, I've kind of retrained my brain to look for tensions, whereas the social psychology and brain sciences were often wired to avoid those tensions, right? We want simple, we want to kind of see the world through kind of a good versus kind of evil lens. So, wicked problems, a lot of issues have lots of underlying values. And then sometimes my work ends out focusing on two particular values, both positive, they're values, right? But that there's an inherent tension between them. Maybe not a zero sum, but they just kind of don't fit, right? So I use polarity management. It's Barry Johnson's work as kind of an additional tool to really, when you have two that you want to dig into, I've done this with lots of different issues. So that's where I'm starting to play with this moral clarity versus intellectual humility, particularly with some of the Gaza protests and so forth, to try to figure out kind of the different sides and how to talk about this. Generally, like you, I imagine, I'm a pretty big advocate for intellectual humility, right? Like, we need more intellectual humility. That's part of my way to kind of push back on our wiring. We want certainty, right? We want clarity. So to push back on that, how do we kind of develop more of a habit of intellectual humility? But if you look at that as a polarity to manage, right? It's not that intellectual humility is always better than moral clarity. It's that we need to have some kind of balance between those, right? And with Barry Johnson's work, I kind of see it also as kind of an Aristotelian kind of virtue, right? It's the ideal mean between extremes. So when you look at something like moral clarity and intellectual humility, the polarity management has these 2x2 boxes, right? So on the top is, if we focus on that value and it just goes beautifully, like best case scenario, what are all the things it connects to, right? But then the reality, just as Aristotle taught us, like, we can go too far, right? We can overemphasize intellectual humility, or we can overemphasize moral clarity. And that's where it gets in problems. So what I'm trying to do is to kind of push people in the middle, but not just this milquetoast middle that says, oh, we need balance, right? It's a much more nuanced one of, okay, what kind of balance? Are we out of balance right now? So when I'm arguing for more intellectual humility, I'm saying, hey, we're too focused on the moral clarity side. We need to shift to intellectual humility. But I also kind of recognize, and this might get into the, should moderates be more intolerant, right? That we can overemphasize that, right? We can have so much intellectual humility that we can't make important distinctions that we need to make. that we lose the importance of judgment and making kind of some claims, whether that's to reality or value claims that have some substance to it, right? So it's kind of setting this framework of we're constantly, and universities in particular, I think, should be an important resources to help us negotiate this tough tension between moral clarity and intellectual humility that we're never going to resolve, right? Because different situations call for a different balance between those.
And just a quick plug, you have a paper, I think, on how universities can do that better, don't you?
Yeah, I do have a chapter in a book that talks about kind of this concept of the Wicked Problems University. So kind of lays out in a sense of, a lot of my work is more with communities. I work a lot with like city managers and so forth on how to build capacity. And one of the biggest kind of insights from my work from 20 years is, communities need these bridging institutions. They need these kind of trusted conveners, someone whose responsibility, facilitators, right? Someone whose responsibility is to help people have these tough conversations we need to have that unfortunately both our brains aren't wired to have naturally. And there's a lot of bad faith actors and conflict entrepreneurs that are trying to take advantage of that, right? So work with community foundations, libraries, different kind of civic groups, but also universities. Can they fill this role of bridging organizations that reframe issues into more of, as a wicked problem, identifying these tensions and helping people kind of negotiate these tensions more productively.
So I wonder if your moral clarity versus intellectual humility distinction blends together the moral and intellectual domains in a way where they might be better separate. So to talk about intellectual clarity versus intellectual humility and moral clarity versus moral humility. But let's come back to that. Because I think it would be helpful to first have a preamble of what I've been struggling with. And here's basically how I would lay it out. There are people whom I admire greatly, like Monica Guzman from Braver Angels and Ibu Patel from Interfaith America as two examples. People who help groups of people have better conversations, empathize with each other, find common ground, etc. It's really important work. It's the kind of thing, the area that I think you and I both started in polarization in terms of the dialogue work that you do at CSU and the dialogue work that I do at CU. And there's some areas where you can really see how that helps reduce polarization. So, for example, there's a huge amount of agreement among Americans on a wide swath of issues, much more than we realize, even on some of the issues that we think are, absolutely most divisive. So just as one example, huge majority of Americans want more border security, more merit-based immigration, but also permanent status for the DACA recipients, for the Dreamers. And there's other examples, basically on any divisive issue you can name, you can come up with actually pretty easily a 2/3 majority policy. My student and I did an op-ed on this a couple of years ago. There are also a lot of disagreements that have to do with people having different priority rankings among values that they share. And understanding that they're disagreeing about priority rankings rather than values might help us disagree without distrusting or disliking each other. So those are both areas where I think approaches, dialogic approaches that are all about empathy and understanding are really important and can lower the temperature among huge swaths of the country in tangible ways. So I'm going to keep doing the work that I'm doing. I hope that you do too. And good on people like Monica Guzman and Ibu Patel. But on the other hand, does anybody actually think that polarization will get solved by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Ilhan Omar singing Kumbaya? I personally don't. Number one. Number two, isn't part of the problem with polarization that the extreme fringes on both sides too often dominate the conversation and then feed off each other? Number three, aren't everyday people in what you might call the moderate majority sometimes pushed to take extreme positions either out of fear of retribution from the extremists on their side if they don't, through things like purity tests? So, for example, there was a New York Times article today about how students in elite colleges are being ostracized by their friends if they think they're Zionist, right? That would be an example of a purity test. Or they take extreme positions because they're afraid of the other side extreme, and they're worried that if they allow their side to seem divided, then the other side's extreme might win, right? This is the side of the debate. Jonathan Chait recently had an article called something like, "Yes, it's okay to punch left," where he was pushing back on the argument among the farther left that, moderate liberals shouldn't criticize them too much because then they are divided and then Trump wins. And then the thing that I think really crystallized this bug in my brain is a modeling study. And you should all be cautious. I do modeling studies, but you should all be cautious about them, right? The all models are wrong. Some are useful. So I'm not saying this modeling study is, perfectly predictive, but it had this interesting result, which was that one way to reduce polarization is for moderates to be more intolerant. If people who are trying to decide whether to be extreme or moderate are, a little bit more afraid of the moderates than they are now, then maybe that would help bring more people to the center. So that's one thing. Also, and this gets, I think, directly at this intellectual, moral, humility, clarity thing. If we take moral clarity seriously on the issues that people on the political fringes on both sides like to wrap themselves in, so American greatness, patriotism, for example, on the right, social justice, helping the most disadvantaged communities among us on the left. If we take those goals seriously, and for the record, I take both of those goals seriously, do we not owe it to ourselves and to those goals to not let people wrap themselves in the moral cloth of those goals when they're being transparently destructive, often in a self-serving way to those goals? So do moderates on the right, for example, not have a duty to say, no, you don't get to wrap yourself in the American flag and then storm the Capitol and deny the results of the election? And do people on the left have the duty to say to their extremes, no, you don't get to wrap yourself in helping the disadvantaged among us and then push policies that get crime out of control or that keep kids out of school for years? That may be two of the most damaging things that have happened in 20 years to the most disadvantaged communities among us. Like, why do you get to wrap yourself in social justice if you're pushing that? Or if you're, chanting slogans that come from sometimes literally Hamas, right? Which is hardly a, left-wing social justice organization for those who don't know the history. And so all this made me wonder, do moderates need sharper elbows? Can we have moral clarity about being intellectually serious, is the way I would put it in your framework, right? If the issues that the extremes are wrapping themselves in and claiming the right to ownership of are so serious, then maybe it's time that the rest of us demand that they take those issues seriously. And if they don't, maybe it's time for the rest of us to say, no, you don't get to wrap yourself in that issue. But then on the other hand, anytime, as somebody who, like you, came up in the more Ibu Patel, Monica Guzman tradition, it's also, I'm from Canada, so it's kind of part of our culture, right? I also worry about a world where moderates are too intolerant, right? Is that just a world where we replace one type of cancel culture with another? Is that a world where we're too cautious in our thinking because we're afraid of being, branded extreme? Is that a world where, we give people power to hog the microphone and then, narcissistic and antisocial moderates hog the microphone, just like narcissistic and antisocial extremists sometimes are hogging the microphone today? So I don't know, but hopefully you can tell that I'm really profoundly struggling with this.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, basically about 15 different topics of discussion came up on that, right? So
good, yeah.
I'll see which ones
we have 45 minutes. So
yeah. I mean, one thing I'll go back to the wicked problems framework, right? Like I talk, and again, I do this with both sides, right? So whenever an issue is framed with only one value being relevant, huge alarm bells go off, right? Whether we're kind of framing it in terms of freedom or liberty, like the Tea Party, or we're framing it in terms of equity from the left, right? Because that automatically frames things as, hey, my side has this value. And as Monica Guzman taught us, like, we love to define people that we disagree with by what they're against, right?
Right.
And that just kind of creates something that, sparks polarization and then undermines our ability to talk to each other. So that's certainly one of my concerns with moral clarity. One way I've been playing with, partly I think we're overusing the word toxic, and then partly I see it as useful, right? So the bottom of the polarity management map, right? When we have when we overemphasize one side of the polarity, you can frame those. So toxic moral clarity is when we're so sure we're right, we stop asking questions, we close our minds, we see things through a very simple lens. And that kind of speaks to some of your concerns of wrapping ourselves with a flag or so forth, right? That we frame things in such a narrow way tied to a positive value that we're so sure we're right. And then we're blind to criticize maybe those people that agree with us, but are doing it in kind of negative ways. The other thing that really kind of came up, another tension I've played with is kind of like how open-minded should we be, right? And I use Kahner's diamond of decision making as kind of one of these key tools that really tough conversations or decisions need to first go through divergent thinking, that we get lots of ideas and get past the usual suspects and kind of challenge assumptions. And this is one of the reasons free speech is so great, right? That we some intellectual humility there, right? Never kind of assume things are fixed. But then once we have a lot of ideas, we have to go through this tough groan zone where we're struggling with these tensions and different perspectives. But then eventually, if we're going to make decisions together, we have to have some convergent thinking. We have to kind of make some decisions. We have to use judgment, and we have to discriminate. We have to say, hey, some arguments are better than others, right? So those three stages that I think conversations have to go through, or even individual decisions, each of those kind of require a different kind of style of communication. So we need the open-mindedness of free speech, but where I see kind of moderates being a little bit more intolerant is at some point we do have to make decisions, right? We can't just always agree to disagree, right? I like the National Governors Association's kind of new disagree better kind of program. We had the governor of Colorado and the governor of Utah on campus kind of talking about this, and I love that kind of stuff. But it also sometimes seems to have a little bit too much of an ethic of it's okay to agree to disagree. Well, democracy, in some sense, especially local democracy in communities, we can't always agree to disagree. Sometimes we have to make decisions. We have to make some tough choices. We have to, for me, that taps into kind of wisdom and judgment, which I don't think we talk about enough in universities anymore. So that's where I think a good process, you can't stay a moderate. You can't just say, I'm always balanced, right? But I think polarity management, going back to where we're not just saying, well, I'll talk about it this way. I'm playing with this idea, I haven't figured it out quite yet, of making a distinction between what I'd call like spatial centrism or spatial moderate, which is just middle of the road, right? So wherever the extremes are, I'm kind of in the middle. And then more of a principled centrism, which I think brings in kind of Aristotle, right? Hey, it's the ideal mean between extremes. It's easy to define the negative extremes, but then you're struggling with that middle point. Sometimes that ideal mean might be further to one side or the other, right? So you're not just kind of this mushy middle that you're comfortable saying, I'm better than the extremists, I'm in the middle. You have some tough conversation of exactly where that middle is.
Yeah, this reminds me of actually a conversation I had at a conference with one of your CSU faculty colleagues, where I identify strongly as a political moderate, more of the second type, I think, than the first type.
Yeah.
And your colleague asked me, what is a moderate? Is a moderate just somebody who flips a coin on every issue? And I said, no, like it doesn't mean that you're always down the middle, right? Sometimes your way, for example, like any good Canadian, I want to take away everybody's guns, right? Like Americans, you have way too many guns. Right? We should buy some of them back. We should have, rigorous permitting processes, et cetera, et cetera. On the other side, I've become convinced that the right is close to right on school choice, that we need some innovation in schools, and probably charter schools and school choice are more useful than that to counterproductive. As just two examples. And there's, many, many other issues where I fall on one side or the other. So it's interesting. It's interesting to think about that way. Let me frame it in the following way. I think of what you were talking about in terms of the tension between decisions and convergent thinking and divergent thinking in terms of what mathematicians would call Bayesian reasoning, right? Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, and again, our listeners don't know any, well, our listeners are a smart group, but we're going to assume that they're not, versed in all the jargon of academia. So for those who don't know, basically Bayesian thinking is the idea that, you don't, when you look at evidence, you don't start from neutral. And that's actually completely rational. You have some prior belief about how the world is, and then based on the strength of the new evidence you see, you update your prior belief. And the stronger your prior belief is compared to the evidence, the less the evidence is going to change your mind. And the stronger the strength of the evidence is compared to the strength of your prior belief, the more the evidence is going to change your mind. Now, the problem with being too narrow-minded is if your prior belief is completely rigid, like if you're 100% sure that you understand something about the world, then you can literally prove mathematically that the value of new information to you is zero.
Yep.
So, for example, when I talk to my students about this, I say, look, if this is you, you're literally wasting your money, right? By being in school. On the other hand, though, if you form your prior beliefs rationally, and not everybody does, in fact, everybody fails to in different situations. But if you form your prior beliefs rationally, and you just saw mountains and mountains of really strong evidence for a particular fact claim, right? Like climate change is real. Not that we need the Green New Deal necessarily, but just the basic fact that we're emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, and that's warming the earth, right? I've seen so much evidence that suggests that that's true, that I think that rationally, my prior belief in climate change being real is really, 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 really strong. And so if somebody sends me a paper that says it's not real, right? It's the sun or something, then I'm going to be, more skeptical of that paper than I would if somebody sent me a paper that said it's real.
Yeah.
And I claim that skepticism is rational. So that, I think, is kind of the intellectual domain, what you're getting at. I think the decisions is maybe a little bit different, and why I think separating the values from the intellectual part can be useful. But on the other hand, sometimes we form our priors irrationally, right? So, there's this famous study where they had like a fake scientific paper that said that coffee drinking causes breast cancer. And they showed it to a bunch of people, and they asked them, to rate how good the study was, how rigorous is it, how much do you trust it? And the group that disproportionately was skeptical of the study were female coffee drinkers, right? It's a classic demonstration of motivated reasoning, right? And it's not that they had seen, well, maybe in a sense they've seen that they've lived their lives drinking coffee, and most cases haven't had breast cancer, right? So maybe there's some rational thinking underneath there. But in the main, the study's authors argued what's going on is motivated reasoning, right? You have a prior against that finding being true. And, for the record, if you're a female coffee drinker, it was a made up study. So as far as I know, it's not true, just to be clear. But you have a prior belief when you're reading that study that's really motivated by the fact that you really don't want it to be true, right? There's lots of things about the world, like I wish it wasn't true that, people with narcissistic and antisocial personality disorders weren't disproportionately drawn to politics. I might have scripted the double negative there, but I believe it's a empirical
and
fact.
Voters are disproportionately drawn to them.
Yeah, right. Exactly. I believe both of those things are at least somewhat empirically supported, right? And the fact that I wish it wasn't true doesn't mean that it isn't. Another example that I have a whole course based on is, there's people who argue that economic growth can't be environmentally sustainable in the long term. And then there's other people who argue that economic growth is way more central to all the gains and prosperity, and also to all the moral progress we've made as growth has made our societies less competitive, much more than we realize. And so we need growth. And I start this class by saying to my students, look, I don't know if either of these arguments is true, but I can tell you that they're not mutually exclusive, right?
No.
And so it's theoretically possible that they're both true, even though I would hate to live in the world where that's the case, because then we have a really big problem to solve. But we better prepare for it and think about it. So maybe let me come back to decisions. What you said about decisions, right? So you talked about the contrast between agree to disagree, like the Governor Cox, Governor Polis approach, and we need to make a decision. Are those two totally mutually exclusive? Like, think about decisions that you make with your spouse, right? You need,
Yeah.
what house are you going to buy, right? This is just something that I'm working on right now. You have to make a decision, but it's still okay to have some people who don't agree with the decision that's made, right? The process is not that we agree on everything and make that decision. It's that we have some balance and some kind of democratic process that, makes it such that, one person's interest isn't always winning, or at the very least, even if the majority, usually wins in a democracy, we at least protect minorities from, having their rights trampled, right? Yeah. And is that really incompatible with the idea that we agree to disagree and yet we make decisions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll say like the Disagree Better program, or even some of these things, what Braver Angels does, and so forth. Those are all good things, right? Particularly because I personally feel polarization and this partisanship is such a huge issue, right? I think it's going to be really impossible for us to deal with any real issue because once it gets polarized, the conversation kind of goes off, right? Facts don't matter, and we make assumptions and so forth, right? So what I would call a dialogue, right? These interactive things that are really primarily focused on depolarizing, on helping us understand each other. Those are all really useful, right? Because I do have these kind of two, kind of competing views of polarization. One, that polarization is our number one issue, and two, that most of it's not real, right? That it's manufactured, that it's exaggerated. Right. So a good dialogic process doesn't have to lead to decisions, right? Just shifting the exaggerated conflict to the actual conflict does a lot of important work, right? Just shifting the person you disagree with from an enemy with bad values to, hey, someone I disagree with that has different perspectives but seems pretty reasonable. That's a huge move for democracy, right? So
let me stop you there and ask you a follow-up question, because I think you've touched on a point that feeds directly into this. Do moderates need to be more intolerant question? You said that polarization is not real, right? And I agree with that. And just to unpack that a little bit, and correct me if I'm wrong,
it's exaggerated, but the perception of polarization is more important than the actual polarization. So it's real in a sense it's having a huge impact. But yeah.
I shouldn't have said it's not real, but I think correct me if I'm wrong, what you're describing is the fact that, for one, the vast majority of people agree on a lot of positions and also don't know that, right?
Yeah. And so that's the perception gap work that we're getting, those cool kind of surveys of, how badly we, understand the other side, right? We over exaggerate how many Republicans or how many Democrats believe something. When we expose that, we realize, okay, wait, we're not as divided as we think.
Okay. But so this is where it gets back to what I'm wrestling with, right? One of the reasons we have that perception gap is that people who are extreme hog the microphone, right?
And I think the political system rewards that, right? If I have to just win an election, negative ads work, being the lesser of two evils work. So I think there's a lot of, whether that's campaigns or just partisan media that feed off these conflict entrepreneurs that are getting rewarded by feeding these simple narratives and taking advantage of human nature, right?
Well, they're taking right. So outrage sells for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that I've started this book project called How Polarization Will Destroy Itself, where I've been digging into these incentives, and my current working hypothesis that I'm trying to flesh out and test in this book is that those incentives are not actually as strong as we think once we take away the fact that the conflict entrepreneurs, as you call them, wrap themselves in these important issues, right? Take Bill Maher as an example, right? He has the, biting rhetoric, right? The ability to mock, and some of the other things that I think are rewarded by the algorithm, right? But he wields them against extremists on both sides.
No.
By pointing out often how counterproductive they are to their own stated goals, right? So I guess in that example, I wonder if are the algorithms rewarding extremists because they're extreme, or because they're biting and clear? They're speaking very clearly in a way that's kind of riling people up. Which again, I guess gets back to like, do we need more Bill Maher's? Do we need more moderates to rile people up? Right?
Well, and I guess two quick things. One is I should give credit that the concept of conflict entrepreneurs comes from Amanda Ripley, who's a journalist.
Right. Yeah.
Great article called "Complicating the Narrative," and then that led to her book High Conflict. But the other thing I'll say is, you mentioned in the introduction that I run the Center for Public Deliberation. I design these meetings, and really the heart of what we try to do in these meetings, bringing people together across perspectives to have better conversations about local issues, is to try to kind of flip that script that you just talked about, right? So if someone at one of our meetings has a very simple solution to a complex problem, they kind of look silly, right? We're trying to change those incentives. Right. We're trying to create an environment in a sense of, someone who's a moderate, someone who's kind of nuanced, that's struggling with these things. There's space for them to talk, right? But I think online and in our political system generally, the incentives are the opposite, right? There's no place for someone often that has kind of more moderate views, right? But I think the good news of the center, I've been running it for 18 years, and I think we figured out for a grant, we've run about 500 meetings in the community or on campus over these 18 years, and almost every single one of them went well, right? So that's the hopefulness of, hey, when you have a good process and all the bells and whistles we do to kind of spark a good conversation, and every meeting people come up to me afterwards saying, hey, we need to do this with this issue, right? So this is the hope, I think, is when you give people an alternative, right? And they understand, no, you can have a real conversation about a tough issue with people you disagree with. I think they want it more, right? There's an appetite. So that's what we're trying to kind of grow together, certainly.
And a lot of that is the power of face-to-face too, right? So for example, I won't name names, but I have had, over the last couple of years, I've had the opportunity to hang out with, have dinner with quite a number of high-profile people on both sides and in the middle, who at times have a very sharp-edged, polemical online persona, right? Occasional dunkers, you might call them, right? And without exception, I have had very collegial, interesting, intellectually rich discussions, sometimes including deep disagreements, because partly this is my own personality. I think it's fascinating to poke, prominent people on their views in private to see where the threads go, right? Yeah. But yeah, in every case, especially maybe in cases where there are deep disagreements, and again, this is, people on both sides, I found that I've had really, really rich discussions that I think maybe is partly a product of, a conversational style, right? I'm asking them questions. I'm not trying to dunk on them, but also I think it's just a face-to-face thing. You're just not going to interact with somebody face-to-face the way you are online or in, a cable news show. But that doesn't fix the problem of cable news and online, right? Yeah. Okay, here's another question related to this Sharp Rebels thing, right? And that is, so suppose you're a moderate liberal, right? And the same would apply if you're a moderate conservative. But I think I see people more struggling with this who are moderate liberals. And that is, how do you punch left without becoming right? Right. So for example, when he first came on the scene, I watched Dave Rubin's podcast, right? He was, for those of you who don't know, I believe his origin story is he was one of the Young Turks. He identified himself as a liberal. And then in the, what you might call the first wave of wokeness, kind of around 2013, 2014, 2015, he became a disaffected liberal, started the Rubin Report show, which he still has. And initially it was, the tenor of it was, I'm a liberal who's punching left. And then over time he became, I think kind of a literal MAGA Trump supporter. right? The James Lindsay maybe is another example of somebody who maybe had an even more extreme transformation. Candace Owens, maybe, she was actually quite woke before she was a right-wing provocateur.
Yeah.
And it was, disillusionment coming from her own brush with cancel culture, as far as I remember, that kind of pushed her to the right. The people who have kind of very publicly become what you might call sharp-elbowed moderates, who haven't then gone either in perception or reality or both completely to the other side, are actually, I think, depressingly rare, right? So I think Bill Maher is maybe the best example I can think of. Konstantin Kisin, I think he's a little bit center right, would be my read on him. Although, he may disagree with that. I think he's like Bill Maher in the sense that he's been consistent. I haven't seen any evidence of him changing his personal views. But again, to some extent, maybe he's perceived as more conservative than he is because he's been very effective at punching left. And then obviously there are the more extreme cases that I just mentioned who definitely have gone to the right. And probably there's some examples of that on the other side. Again, I'm more familiar with the kind of disaffected liberal becoming conservative. And so some of that's perception. So why does that happen, right? My best guess is that some of it's perception, right? If you're always, for example, my good friend and frequent collaborator, Roger Pilkey Jr., I think is a great example of somebody where it's mostly, if not entirely, perception, right? Like every time I disagree with something Roger says, I'm usually on his right, right? He's definitely a liberal, right? But he's, so known for punching left on what he sees as climate activists and scientists getting out over their skis, to push an agenda that I think I know that he's perceived by many in our climate community as a right winger. Again, even though, I know as someone who knows him well and knows that, I'm a moderate who pretty much always disagrees with him from the right, that he's definitely a liberal, and he's been actually pretty consistent if you sort of closely parse what he actually says on that. So partly his perception, partly I think though, where it becomes reality, I think comes to our pathological human psychology and groupishness, right? Like if you are a disaffected liberal who starts punching left, you're going to get a lot of friends on the right, right? And you're going to get a lot of enemies on the left. And if you're a disaffected, a lot of unfriending, right? And if you're in, I've experienced some of this on a small scale, right? If you're in a predominantly left institution, particularly, for your livelihood, that's kind of scary, right? The idea that, I'm losing, key friends in my current vocation, and then you're winning friends, and you could see, right, you can see that if you cultivate those new friends, right, then that can be very lucrative, right? Jordan Peterson famously said that he had monetized social justice warriors, right? And then so then if you kind of are embraced by the other side and you take comfort in that and you take solace in that as kind of a refuge from what you're getting from your own side, I could see how it would be easy cognitively to, not want to alienate that other side. Because then did you have anybody? And some of that I think is irrational. Like my experience has been, like, for example, I try my best to not be afraid to piss off any side, right? And so, for example, there's a single author at the Heartland Institute, the same person, who 2 years ago wrote an article basically calling me a brave truth teller for my work on, how the hot climate scenarios were too hot. And then just recently wrote another article saying I was a Democratic shill for my paper that estimated that climate change, basically people's opposition to climate change denial, might have cost Trump the 2020 election, right? My personal experience is that you win more friends than enemies by at least trying. Nobody's perfect. I'm sure I'm not perfect, but I at least try to, be trustworthy and act with integrity and go where the chase leads, regardless of who it pisses off. And so far, my experience has been that, even if people disagree with you or don't like something that you say, most people kind of trust you and treat you with respect because they at least see that you're not nobody owns you, right? But certainly you get it from both sides, and that can be scary. And it maybe is true that like if I really piss off the left tomorrow, it's going to be harder for me to become Jordan Peterson than it is for Jordan Peterson to become Jordan Peterson. But how do you think about that? Like have I characterized that right? And kind of how do we break out of that incentive structure? Or is it just something that matters for people who want to be public intellectuals who aren't that for a big fraction of the population? And so who cares, shut up.
Yeah, no. I mean, I think like the easiest way I can explain the work that I try to do is someone who understands the social psychology and brain science or likes to think he does. So then I try to design processes that avoid triggering the worst of human nature and actually tap into the best. But the reality is the people that do the opposite, that know the social psychology and take advantage of the negative aspects of human, feed people the simple narratives, that's always going to be much more lucrative, right? The market rewards that a lot more, right? They're getting paid a lot more. So that's kind of, the conflict entrepreneurs versus the facilitators and the conveners. But I think, especially, we're seeing with the polls, people are so frustrated with the partisanship and, that there is kind of some possibility there of kind of creating. And you're seeing it in the last 5 or 10 years, right? So many of these organizations, Bridge USA and the Braver Angels and starts with, more and more kind of organizations of people that are, trying to kind of figure out, okay, how do we kind of exist here more and push back on that polarization in a sense. So, when I kind of work with people, thinking about depolarization, there's always this, okay, what can an individual do? How do you think differently, right? How do you, make sure you have a better kind of media diet, and how do you kind of understand these things? But that's never going to be enough, right? Because if you're the reasonable person that struggles with attention in an environment that always rewards kind of simple narratives, you're going to kind of get run over, right? So one of the reasons my work focuses on local communities is, how do you start building capacity in a local community that starts changing those incentives, right? So it's not just individual people behaving differently, but now you actually have structures and you have supports that starts kind of changing the conversation. And the good news, there's a lot of bad news on the social psychology and brain science, but the good news is the more we understand that, the less power it has, right? Once you really understand your brain wants a simple narrative, then when something seems very simple, you're like, maybe I'm missing something, right? And you start kind of asking questions. And so that's what we're hoping to kind of build more. The other piece to all this that when I'm kind of figuring out my role, mainly my role is to run an impartial organization. The CBD is an impartial resource in Northern Colorado. I've written some on this, come up with this concept called principled impartiality that tries to kind of bring out the tensions with that, right? That I need to be seen as impartial to do my work, to be this host for people to trust me. But I also have commitments to small d democracy, which has some values in there. And I have commitments to good information, right? If one side clearly has clear empirical information, the other side has kind of BS talking points, I don't want to be neutral there, right? So I'm constantly negotiating those three tensions. And a lot of my work ultimately is pragmatic, right? That I'm going to lean on the dialogue stuff and more of the both sides, maybe even kind of the danger of falling into a false equivalency, because I think that's kind of the first necessary steps to kind of undo some of this polarization, to kind of create some trust, that then we can get to these later stages of the convergent thinking, right? So part of my assumption in my work is, if we have better processes, and I'm, maybe sometimes leaning too hard to the impartial side, is because that gets us to a point that then we can have the really tough discussions. And I have, maybe a naive belief that when we get to the point of having really good discussions, hopefully the better arguments now have more power, right? This is one of, when I talk about wicked problems, I talk about, shifting from the easy assumption that problems are caused by wicked people to putting the wickedness in the problem and see how that kind of changes conversation. And often when I'm giving my talk, I stop there and I say something like, I'm not saying that there's not wicked people, right? Clearly
right.
There's much fewer wicked people than we think, right? Like half the country isn't evil, right?
Correct.
And then I also know from the social psychology that very few people would self-identify as wicked. So pragmatically, telling someone that you think they're wicked is unlikely to make them less wicked, right? It's just going to kind of undermine the conversation. So I talk, if there is an issue that truly is kind of oppressors oppressing people, that kind of simple narrative that we hear a lot. I think they love the fact that we're all screaming at each other and facts don't matter, right? That makes it easier for them, right? So my goal again is, how do we elevate the conversations? How do we figure out ways of talking to each other? Which again leans a lot more to the dialogue and the kind of both sides and the intellectual humility, right? To get us to a point then that we can actually have the real discussions. Ultimately we do need to make decisions together, but processes, an individual process to try to kind of undo some of the polarization and create some new relationships and build connections don't have to, right? So my pushback on the disagree better or agreeing to disagree isn't those things aren't useful, right? It's those are necessary but not sufficient to the capacities we need in our communities or in our democratic communities eventually to kind of make this work better.
Yeah, an interesting solution that I think applies both to the face-to-face dialogue domain and the public domain comes from this book called Grandstanding. Have you read it? By Brandon Wormke and Justin Tosi. They were both on sabbatical here at CSU recently. And basically they argue that you want to create incentives against grandstanding, but the way to do that is not to directly call out people and say, hey, you're grandstanding, right? What they say you should do instead is publicly mock the idea of grandstanding and the general behavior pattern of grandstanding, such that people who engage in it have these pangs of internal shame without being kind of directly called out and then being offended and being defensive and all these things. Is that a way maybe that moderates can have sharper elbows in a way that's useful without reproducing cancel culture or reproducing, some of the divisiveness that we've seen, in a sense? I mean, Bill Maher does sometimes mock specific people, right? But he also often mocks general perspectives or points of view or patterns of behavior that he finds to be, mock worthy. Right? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that pops in my head a little bit, right? So within the deliberative democracy world, there's a lot more talk now about kind of deliberative systems, right? And and I like to think of, the community I work with here in Northern Colorado as a deliberative system, the CBD being a particular kind of institution within that system. Part of this was a shift of, I used to see my work as running these individual meetings. Now I see myself as, what can I do to intervene to kind of improve this system, right? And part of the work on deliberative systems is, we don't need everyone to be this reasonable person. Not everyone has to be deliberative, right? So we need activists, or even going back to the initial moral clarity versus intellectual humility. I think we need some people that are probably too far on the moral clarity side, right? Because they can kind of help challenge the status quo and they can force us to ask some big questions. And, so it's not that moral clarity is always bad. It's just when the dominant voices are the only voices we hear are moral clarity, especially if they're just talking past each other, right? So that grandstanding, we need some people to grandstand, right? Because they're an important part of the overall kind of system of what we need to hear. We need strong activist voices. But ultimately, the problem is that they're often the dominant voices, right? And we don't have that process, like I talked about earlier, about negotiating the tensions kind of between them, right? So I'm not sure that gets to the grandstanding, but
it does a little bit. So maybe let me drill in on 2 points that raises. So the first is, I totally agree with you that we need a diversity of approaches, right? So even if it's true that we need more Bill Mahers, I don't think we need fewer Monica Guzmans, right? Yeah. So those are not, it's not like one approach or the other is mutually exclusive. Secondly, the thing you just brought up about, we need some grandstanders. The way I think of that is in terms of what Jenny Sook Gerson called megaphones and gavels. She wrote this article maybe 10-ish years ago called Trading the Megaphone for the Gavel. I think it was in Harvard Law Review. And basically her argument, this is kind of, maybe it was less than 10 years ago. It was kind of when the Me Too movement was in full force. And her argument was basically that, there's a time for megaphone tactics, right? When you're trying to raise awareness about an issue that's not in the public consciousness, then there's an advantage to being simple, right? If you say, hey, there's this important thing, but it's complicated, right? People turn off, especially if they're not already thinking about it. And so, nuance is your enemy when you're a megaphone trying to raise awareness for an issue. But when you are in charge, then you need complexity. And if you don't have complexity, then you're going to have injustice. And so she talks about examples of that in the case of, some of the young men who ended up being railroaded and kicked out of college on, poorly investigated charges of sexual misconduct, and which in some cases turned out to be provably false. And she also, I think, pointed out that those men who, were victim of that were disproportionately Black men, partly probably because of internalized stereotypes that people have. And so her argument was basically that, look, feminism, you're in charge now, right? You weren't in charge in the 60s and 70s, but you're kind of in charge now, particularly in places like college campuses. And so it's time to trade the megaphone for the gavel. So I really like that distinction, but I think about it a little bit differently in the sense that I think it's pretty rare, actually, for the trade from the megaphone to the gavel to happen within people. Right. I think it's often that, there's some people who are really good at being megaphones and they shouldn't be president. Right. And there's some people who are, really good gavels, and they're, not going to be the people that get some issue that we're not thinking about, on the map. And so I wonder to what extent this maps onto polarization, right? Like and this maybe gets at the second thing I wanted to raise, which was, how do we make this work in universities? Right. I think one of the reasons we're so polarized, and one of the reasons why we think we're even more polarized than we are, I think, is that we have too many megaphone people occupying gavel roles in society. And I think campus is a great example of that. And secondly, I think we need to decide, where do you draw the line between, acceptable boundary pushing and unacceptable boundary pushing megaphone behavior, right? The protests, the pro-Palestinian protests on campuses are a perfect example of this, right? Are you going to let people shout in the quad, free Palestine, even if they sometimes chant things that are anti-Semitic? Free speech says you have to, right? If you're a public college. And in most cases, I would support that unequivocally. But are you going to let people, stop their peers from going to class if they think they're Zionists? I hope not, right? Are you going to let people vandalize public property? I hope not. Are you going to let people make, explicit threats of violence against other people, especially, and explicitly call for genocide? Now, even though they were widely lampooned for it as a matter of First Amendment law, I'm pretty sure Claudine Gay and her peers were basically right in terms of what they said to Congress, that even obscene things like calling for genocide can be protected speech under the First Amendment, depending on the context. Even though we don't like it, and that's the whole point of the First Amendment, is it doesn't mean anything if it doesn't protect speech that we find repulsive. But so do I have that right? And kind of how should we think about institutional neutrality and megaphones and gavels, like in academia? Like, do we? Yeah. Let me ask you, let me phrase it as some specific questions that people are asking, right? So one is, do we need to be more intentional about building political diversity, among the faculty? Do we need to be less tolerant of academics, and in some cases, some would argue whole disciplines that have completely abandoned any pretense of intellectual rigor, for megaphony, sometimes fairly anti-intellectual, sometimes fairly intolerant, activism, right? Do we need to keep giving those disciplines faculty lines? Some people would say no. And then how do we be, should we be neutral as an institution? And what does that mean, for example, around issues like climate change, right? Like, does being institutionally neutral mean that we have to give equal voice to climate deniers? And again, when I say climate deniers, I mean people who literally deny that the greenhouse effect is happening and the planet is warming because of greenhouse gas emissions. I don't mean people who, disagree with the less favorite climate policies, just to be clear.
Yeah.
How do you think about that?
Yeah, no, again, lots of good stuff in there to dig into. Now, I have one slide in the basic presentation I give quite a bit where I make this distinction between kind of traditional leadership and facilitative leadership. And, traditional leadership is, I got charisma, rah, I got a strong opinion, I can rile people up. And that's still necessary in certain situations, particularly kind of in a crisis situation. And facilitative leadership, the argument I make is I think the superpower of 21st century leaders that we need is the ability to bring people together, right? And so that's a kind of a different skill set in a way. But the problem is our political system tends to elect the traditional leaders, but once they're elected, we need them to be a facilitative leader, and it tends not to be the same people, right? They don't have that skill set. Though I think at the local level sometimes, right? I think the local level, facilitative leaders, the local level, you have to actually, solve problems, right? So you can't just kind of keep on getting elected just because you kind of play on a side. So thinking differently about leadership, and how do we kind of mix those? The other thing that popped in was you're talking through there. I've taught social movement classes, social movement theory, and traditionally the kind of cycle of social movements is they start off very kind of us versus them, very like, good versus evil, simple frames. But then at some point they start getting power. People in power are listening to them, right? So that's when they normally split, right? So they split into the kind of purists, like, no, they're evil, and the pragmatists that are like, well, now they're listening to us, right? So we should work with them, right? So I think that's similar to
the famous MLK versus Malcolm X thing, right?
Huh?
Kind of like a little bit like the famous MLK versus Malcolm X kind of split that people often talk about.
Yeah. But I agree. Sometimes it's a different skill set with people to be able to kind of shift. So to think about the role of universities, I like Ron Daniels' book. He's the president of Johns Hopkins. Wrote a book about universities owe democracy. I think he does a pretty nice job of kind of identifying some issues. And towards the end, he's like, universities need to do a little bit more. I would kind of frame it as bridging work or deliberative work. He didn't use the word deliberative, right? But how do we kind of create more opportunities for kind of useful engagement across perspectives and to help equip our students with more of those kind of individual skills? And that's something I very much kind of believe that, university needs to be a platform. It has to be a platform for a lot of megaphones, right? Not only legally because of free speech, but I think, ethically that we need people to have kind of strong opinions to challenge us. But if it's all just a whole bunch of individual speakers I think that's asking people to do too much, right? So how do we start innovating in universities, doing what you're doing, what I'm doing, right? Of, providing kind of useful debate, which can be hard, right? That's not just the spectacle. It's not just people talking past each other. I have this one Venn diagram I've been trying to kind of write an article on of, debate, dialogue, and deliberation as these three kind of interactive communication technologies that they don't happen naturally, right? They need kind of support. They need a facilitator. They need, and they each kind of play a different role, right? So debate is this technology that helps us, ideally a good debate elevates good arguments and exposes bad arguments, which is pretty important for us to be able to deal with issues.
Kind of like dialectic.
Yeah. And, dialogue is, like I mentioned earlier, is more about the, bringing people together, creating some understanding and some relationships. The problem with dialogue, from my perspective, is it tends to be non-judgmental, right? So dialogue is necessary but not sufficient. For me, deliberation, and here's my bias. I run the Center for Public Deliberation. So deliberation for me, when done well, kind of captures the best of debate, the rigor, the kind of notion of elevating good arguments, exposing bad ones, but also kind of captures the best of dialogue in terms of creating a situation where people can kind of listen to each other and kind of have those aha moments where their caricatures kind of get exposed. So how do the downfall of deliberation, I should be fair, is it's really hard. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort, right? A good debate and a useful dialogue is a lower bar, right? But I think universities need to think about, okay, to what degree are we providing these three things, not only to our campus community, but to our broader community? Because like I said earlier, our communities need these facilitators, these conveners that can help us come together. And universities can play that role so well in our local communities as we kind of go through. Right?
Well, and in fact, public universities, I would argue, it's our job. Right.
Yeah. And for land grant like CSU, right? That's part of our mission, right? Is to kind of help people, address their shared problems more productively.
And even private universities get enormous sums of money from the government for things like grants and tax breaks and things. So I want to end with the topic of, how can universities do this better, which obviously maybe a little bit different from this broader thing about sharp elbow centrism, but maybe is related.
No.
So you talked about, we need more opportunities for, certainly students and faculty and probably staff to engage in deliberative dialogue. So imagine you're talking to a college president, right? So obviously one thing they can do is give more money to your program, right? Make it bigger. Make something like it mandatory for incoming freshmen. Is that enough? And if not, what else should we do to, correct me if the following is wrong. I think kind of underneath some of what we've been wrestling with is the assumption that universities are not totally doing the job of facilitating, of being this convener that they should be. Push back on that if that's a wrong claim.
No.
But if you agree with that, imagine that you're talking to the president of CSU. Like, what would you tell her?
Yeah. Ironically, I was on a podcast with the president of CSU just on Monday, right?
I know, that's why.
And luckily, she certainly, she's the one that brought Ron Daniels to campus because she really liked his book. CSU is trying to see supporting democracy, small d democracy, as kind of one of their pillars. So there's some exciting times here. We just had this big democracy thematic year and a democracy summit. So those kind of resources, I think, hopefully CSU is kind of going that right way, right? In my work, I started the center 18 years ago. I've written on this that I think every college university should have a center like this, right? But both in terms of the skill set that students learn. If people don't know, I train students in my classes as facilitators. So they're the ones that are running the events in the community. At this point, we get hired by the city or the county or school districts or the university to kind of run these events. I've been doing this for 20 years. I've seen it grow. More and more universities are doing this work. So I think that chapter I mentioned, I think there's 3 broad narratives about universities, all of them somewhat false, and all of them, I think, ultimately negative. One is the ivory tower, right? That we're just kind of disconnected and kind of, arguing about how many angels fit on a pin or whatever. The second one is more just kind of glorified job training, right? That it's all about getting a piece of paper and getting, and then the third is kind of the social justice warrior. Like, we've been captured. We're trying to indoctrinate your kids. So what I'm trying to do is kind of build this fourth narrative, which I think is a much more hopeful and pragmatic and useful one, of the kind of Wicked Problems University, the university as kind of this platform. And for me, it takes on what I think are the 2 biggest challenges we're dealing with in democracy. One is the polarization that we've already talked about. And then the second is just kind of this information kind of overload disorder, misinformation, disinformation. Our ability to create information and share information has completely exploded. Our ability to make sense of that and to shift from data to knowledge to eventually wisdom has not caught up, right? And that's where the debate part comes in. That's where the rigor. That's where the agreeing to disagree is not enough, right? So we need to take on both of those challenges, and I think universities are well situated to take on both of those challenges if that becomes kind of the focus of our work.
So let me offer a provocation, and feel free to respond to it positively or negatively or in a mixed way. And I'll preface this to say that, as the whole premise of this episode is that I'm struggling with this, right? So wrestling with this. So I don't know if these are my final thoughts.
Which is a wonderful thing, right? We need to do that more, right? Like, I'm struggling with
totally,
this.
Right? This is exactly what you're. This is the fourth narrative about universities you're describing.
Yeah.
But I have spent a lot of time thinking about, what would I say if I was talking to, university leaders, and on a few occasions I've had opportunities to talk to university leaders like you have. And here's kind of where I am now. So yes, absolutely, we need more programs like yours, probably at a larger scale, probably at least some form of it being mandatory for freshmen. So we all have, a shared skill set for being rigorous thinkers, for disagreeing better, etc. But I don't think that goes far enough. I would add the following things to it.
Done.
Number one, enforce the policies you already have written down. So I think one of the challenges with where universities have lost trust recently is by enforcing policies that don't exist. For example, when people are being canceled for, innocuous speech, right? I was once called into the office of a DEI dean and asked to apologize for saying in a public talk that I was invited to give by the chancellor that immigrants risk their lives to come to America. We should believe in ourselves, which is true. Right? I refuse to apologize. Right. So, we can stop enforcing rules that don't exist. We can start enforcing rules that do exist. Right. So there are lots of rules that went unenforced with some of the more violent versions of the protests and counter protests on campuses recently. I would argue that in many campuses, there are discrimination laws that are broken routinely and things like faculty hiring, and pretty brazenly. And I think we should do, and I think that whereas I am skeptical and inherently cautious about the Chris Rufo approach of, outside stakeholders coming in and blowing the place up. I think that, there are many more ways that could go badly than that could go well, right? But on the other hand, I absolutely think that outside forces, particularly in public universities, should be holding our feet to the fire to enforce policies we have already. Yeah. And I think the fact that we often don't is a huge source of demoralization for some of our talent, right? Who wants to work in a place where you don't actually know what the rules are, right? Where you go to a training on your faculty orientation and say, hey, these are the rules. Here's what you can do. Here's what you can't do. And then on a day-to-day basis, it might be totally different. So enforce the rules. And I think in many cases, we need outside actors to make us enforce the rules and bring the hammer down on us when we don't. That's number one. Number two, again, I think the Chris Rufo approach has more dangers than upsides of the elected government saying we're going to drastically reallocate resources away from these ideological priorities and towards these ones. I think that's a very slippery slope. But on the other hand, I think that one of the things that protects universities against toxic polarization is that whereas on social media and cable news, the incentives may be for simplistic thinking and outrage, I don't actually think it so much is the case in terms of our students, right? No parent wants to pay tens of thousands of dollars for their child to come back as a, fire-breathing, simplistic thinking demagogue, right? And they especially don't want them to come back and think that that's what they paid for them to learn. And so, and on the flip side, if we say, if the university presidents say, look, we're going to throw a few $1,000s at Martín, right? And we're going to have a bigger deliberative dialogue center, but then we're also going to throw a bunch of money at these, very divisive, sometimes anti-intellectual megaphones on campus, right? Then what are the overall market incentives telling us? Now, again, that doesn't mean that Chris Rufo should come in and say, we're going to take away their money to give it to you. But here's maybe kind of a middle ground, right? And that is don't protect departments or disciplines from the market, right? So if a discipline or a department becomes such a ideological monoculture that they become what Jonathan Haidt calls structurally stupid, right? Where they're getting priors not from evidence, they're enforcing kind of thought policing, they're trying to infringe on the rights of other people on campus. Don't shut them down like Chris Rufo would do, because that's a slippery slope, for academic freedom. But if they stop getting students sign up, which I predict they will, don't save them. Don't give them faculty lines. Don't make people in other disciplines take their classes to kind of prop them up. And if there are disciplines that, the most extreme, I'm not going to name the university because this is something I heard secondhand. So in case I'm wrong, right, on the facts, but I heard a story about a university that had a department, and I won't name the department, but for the record, it was not one of the departments that you would expect, right? So it didn't end in studies, right? It was like a typical, longstanding kind of discipline department. The new leader of the university decided that that this department had become ossified. It had become an echo chamber. It wasn't producing high quality research at a good clip. And so I can't remember if it was the chancellor or the president or the dean went to the department and said, look, here's what we think the problem is. We're not going to fire anybody, right? We take tenure and academic freedom seriously. But here's what we're going to do. We need this discipline in our university. We're not getting rid of this discipline, right? And you can imagine how this would apply. Again, this was a very traditional discipline in this case, but you can imagine how it would apply to any discipline, right? For example, most people who think that, say you have an ethnic studies department that somebody says has become way too much of an echo chamber. The vast majority of people who would say that, I think, would not argue that we need to stop studying and trying to fix racial inequality, right? So imagine the same kind of distinction, but with a traditional discipline. So this university leader said, look, we want this discipline. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a new department in this discipline. We're going to invite some of you to come over. Those of you that we think are doing good work. And we're not going to do anything to the rest of you. We're not going to fire you, but you're never going to get another faculty line. You're never going to get another retention. And we're going to invest all that instead in this new department. And again, I'm not naming the university or the department in case this story is wrong or is from a different, the institution was misnamed. But in the story that I heard, the new department ended up pretty quickly, within like 20 years, becoming one of the best in the country in that discipline. And so that's maybe, I think, the closest I've heard articulated to like an intermediate approach between like do nothing. I think it was like a spectrum, right? You could do nothing and just kind of let it happen. You can let the market, keep shared governance, not interfere with anybody, but let the market, don't protect anybody from the market consequences of their decisions. You can do what I just described, which is kind of heavy-handed, and then kind of on the extreme, you can do what Chris Rufo's doing at the New College of Florida, and say, we're going to close this and that discipline in that department. Okay, that was a long provocation. What do you think? What would you say if you were the president?
Yeah, I think, part of me worries. I'm not sure I'm happy with letting the market decide what disciplines we have and where we hire and so forth, right? Because sometimes the more popular classes are they popular for the right reasons or not, and so forth, right?
Right. And the job training thing, this gets back to like, is everyone just going to be engineering and data science and then we lose humanities? I wouldn't argue for that. So yeah. I agree, it's tricky.
Yeah. But thinking more broadly in terms of, okay, what can universities do? Upper administration to kind of encourage this kind of work, right? So we already talked about some of them having the work that we do. Obviously, we're biased towards that. And you're seeing what we just had Robert Putnam come to campus as part of the democracy kind of summit that we had. And he talked about these bonding and bridging groups and the importance of that, right? And a lot of my work is, hey, we need more bridging groups. So sparking some of that. One of my friends here, Elizabeth Sink, has just started a really cool interfaith kind of program, right? That the university needs more resources, right? So they started, but and obviously with the situation in the Middle East kind of blowing up, they're seeing, hey, the value of having kind of people focused on that. I know y'all already have a Bridge USA student group. I'm trying to kind of get one here as well, right? So how do we get more resources, whether they're extracurricular or curricular? The other thing I'll kind of add that we haven't talked about is, I think sometimes, the incentives of universities, particularly for faculty, are publishing in your individual journals, right? And universities have always talked a good game about interdisciplinary and so forth, putting more to that, right? Because, dealing with helping our communities deal with tough issues, those are inherently going to be interdisciplinary, right? So how do we kind of create more of those structures that help kind of people across disciplines? I think sometimes the narrow view is rewarded, right? Because you want to become an expert in this very specific thing. That's how you get published. And now there's so many journals and kind of different areas that it kind of allows you to do that. So really, is one thing that we're playing with now with our new vice president of research of, how do we maybe create some really cool incentives for the process people like me to work with some of the experts, right, to kind of come together to help our communities kind of take on these big challenges and create, again, switching those incentive processes that help us kind of play this role a little bit more. And then thinking about, actually, Elizabeth Cinco, I just mentioned, she just got hired away from our department to go to the honors program. So she's going to be teaching, developing a class, which is very much kind of cutting across perspectives and kind of skill sets every year to all our honor students, right? So that's a positive move, I think, right? Because it's really focusing on those bridging skills and those facilitative leadership skills that I think we need to make sure all our students get exposed to as they kind of go through.
Okay, so maybe to wrap up, let me ask you, and this is I'm kind of asking you for a soundbite answer, which you're not going to want to give me, and that's fine. Yeah. So take as much time as you want. I'm just going to put the question that we started with to you.
Yeah.
Do moderates need to be more intolerant?
No. So I would say yes. Well, one distinction I'm starting to make in my head from this conversation, right, is because I don't know if I would consider my primary role is as this impartial facilitator, deliberative practitioner, and kind of creating processes. Now, generally, my processes are going to give more space to moderates, right? But I don't really see my own personal individual politics. Yeah, I would call myself a principled centrist. I'm in the middle on some different issues. But that's not really the role I play, right? So I think there's this distinction between, hey, do we need more kind of moderates with sharp elbows, as you put it? And I also think we need more kind of facilitators. We need more people that their role is kind of being this convener, facilitator, and so forth. And there's some overlap there, right? But I think those are two different kind of ways of thinking that I think universities should kind of encourage both in a sense. But from my kind of polarity management kind of framework, I think if the danger of overemphasizing intellectual humility, right, or overemphasizing neutrality or impartiality from that practitioner perspective is problematic, right? Because you lose the ability to make some distinctions that I think are sometimes important to make, right? So being a moderate isn't saying, everyone's right? That's part of my pushback on over glorifying open-mindedness sometimes, right? We need open-mindedness in the first part of a process, but eventually we may have to make decisions together. And if we, from an open-minded perspective, if we're saying, hey, everyone's position is just as good as everyone else's, that undermines our ability to make good decisions together, right? So that's where I think, moderates sometimes have to have sharper elbows. But it's that Aristotelian kind of search for that ideal mean between extremes, which unfortunately is a moving target, right? It's not a simple kind of, add up both sides and divide by 2 to get in the middle, right? No, right. It's this hard process of, yes, we need more balance, but where that balance is always going to be a tough thing. So I do think, so my argument for intellectual humility is I think we're too far. We need to recalibrate, right? And allow more intellectual humility. But one thing I like about polarity management is this recognition that you could always overcorrect, right? Like Barry Johnson argued that too often we see things as problems to solve rather than polarities to manage, right? So it's not that, hey, we need to all be intellectually humble versus having moral clarity. It's like, well, right now it's kind of the loudest voices are on one side, so we need more intellectual humility with the recognition or the, making sure we don't overcorrect that. Like, hey, we're all completely humble, so then we don't let good information play its role, or we don't let better arguments have hopefully more power in our communities than bad arguments.
Can we, without moving more to one side or the other in that polarity than you want, can we insist within academia when we hire people and promote people, et cetera, that they have to be intellectually serious? They have to be pragmatic. They have to be interested in chasing the evidence where it leads. If you're in a discipline that's oriented around a problem, which is fine, right? I'm in environmental studies. It's fine to have a discipline that's about solving a problem. but you have to care about the facts. You have to care about the details. You have to be open-minded enough to find, not to say, oh, maybe climate change isn't real, right? But to seek out, new evidence, and maybe also intellectual seriousness requires being open-minded enough to talk to other serious scholars who disagree with you, including on moral questions. Can we insist on that, or have I gone too far and one side of your
people
polarity?
To sign like a humility statement as part of their application process?
No, please, no. Enough. I hate communism, but we shouldn't have had any communist loyalty oaths, right? It's like please, no, I don't want to have it's like, the solution to the anti-Semitism on campuses is not just to have like a new Jewish affinity group, right? A new Jewish DEI office. It's the same kind of thing. No, not a statement, but we do in theory, through peer review and shared governance, hold ourselves and each other to standards, right? To standards of scholarship. Can we be more explicit and discerning about intellectual seriousness being part of that standard? You can still be a megaphone to a point and be intellectually serious. But I do think that the university, unlike in society, right, as a whole, in the university, our job is to produce and disseminate knowledge, right? One of the things I always say when I interview grad students is, what is the thing that you don't know that if you knew, we'd be better able to solve the problem you care about? And if you don't have an answer to that, then don't come to grad school, right? If the thing that you think needs to be done is we just need to adopt this policy that I already know is the best, then universities, I don't actually think are the place to best advance that, right? No. You'll be much more effective at advancing that within an advocacy organization. So that's, I guess, in the sense where maybe I'm a little bit more explicit and willing to be on a little bit on one side of your polarity for universities and say, look, our job is not to solve all of society's problems. It's to be the intellectual engine of society. And to do that, we do need to insist on some intellectual standards, even if that is in tension with other roles, other more megaphony roles that are useful in broader society.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this might open too much of a can of worms now.
Last word to you. Go.
Well, one thing I'm playing with, and this goes back to things universities can do. So I have been asked by a university to kind of help think through how do we introduce free speech to our new incoming students, and particularly during student orientation, the parents are there too, right? So I've just started that kind of process, thinking through, and part of this, I think I can do this somewhat quick. There's this tension between kind of honoring freedom of speech, which partly is a legal obligation, right? I'm sometimes concerned universities over legalize it, right? Like the argument for free speech sometimes becomes we have to, right? Like, no, there's a good substantive argument for free speech that we sometimes lose. I go back to John Stuart Mill with that, certainly, right? But there's this tension between, we have to honor free speech, or we want to, and we also want to be welcoming and inclusive and not harm marginalized voice. So it's primarily that tension. What I've been trying to introduce to that as I engage that is exactly what you're talking about. But yeah, universities also care about rigor and kind of quality, right? Like and excellence, and
it's a false tension. Just to make a quick point, right?
No.
Do you know what harms marginalized communities way more than offensive comments? Unrigorous thinking about their problems.
Right. Yeah. Or even,
as I would argue, we've seen.
One of the books I was reading lately, I don't have the author in my head, but I know people in university like it, about free speech. I think it's from makes the argument one of the problems with free speech lately has seemed to be more kind of the supporters of free speech from the right, whereas you go back to the 60s and 70s and anti-war and civil rights movement and so forth, so people have lost that in a way, right? So they see that. I mean, there is a tension, but yeah, it's an exaggerated tension, right? Of seeing, it's free speech versus collusion, right? That there goes away. But you add on to, we also want rigor, and there's some interesting tensions. Long term, I think there's free speech and rigor goes together, right? Sometimes in the short term, we're letting people say some pretty dumb stuff, right? like I would struggle. Sure. I wouldn't be happy if someone invited Dinesh D'Souza to my campus, not because he's conservative, but because he's, does really bad history, right? So it more violates kind of But even when I talk about things like, we need processes that elevate strong arguments and expose weak arguments, it's also the recognition that what's a strong argument and what's a weak argument is really complex, and we don't obviously want universities to be the arbitrators of what's true and what's not true, right? So that has its own kind of tensions within that.
But maybe we do want them to be arbiters on what's rigorous and what's not.
Huh?
Maybe we do want them to be arbiters on what's rigorous and what's not, though, right? In terms of the process of finding truth claims.
Yeah. And I think we've lost that some, right? We don't talk about, or even like you mentioned that you see the purpose of universities as producing and disseminating kind of knowledge, right? Going back to Jonathan Haidt, he had that interesting speech about the telos of the university. Should it be
right.
social justice or truth? And that did what I think heterodox wanted to do, which is sparked a lot of conversation, kind of back and forth, right?
Yep.
One of my favorite responses to that was kind of, maybe it should be more inquiry. I started writing one more of like, I think the purpose of university should be cultivating wisdom, which captures a lot of that truth, but but I think there needs to be a broader conversation about what the, purpose of university. And I don't think it has to be one, right? So even going back to, it's okay if some people at universities that they see the purpose of university to be social justice, right? That can't be the overarching, right? And I agree with some of his criticisms when you're focused too much on that, then that tension with truth kind of comes out. But I think universities they're going to have multiple purposes. For me, the more we understand those multiple purposes and then recognize the tensions between them, that helps us have better conversations about what universities should be. Right?
Well, lots of interesting threads to pull, but I'm going to honor my promise to give you the last word. And thank you for coming on the Free Mind podcast. For those of you who are in the Colorado, especially the Colorado State area, do check out Martin's work on deliberative dialogue. It's really important work. We definitely need more of it. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thank you, buddy.
Free Mind podcast is produced by the Benson Center for the Study of Western Civilization at the University of Colorado Boulder. You can email us feedback at freemind@colorado.edu or visit us online at colorado.edu/center/Benson. You can also find us on social media. Our Twitter, LinkedIn, and YouTube accounts are all at Benson Center. Our Instagram is at The Benson Center, and the Facebook is at Bruce D. Benson Center.